Welcome to Wild Heart Revival, a gathering place for conversations and stories as pathways of renewal and revival. I am your host, Tay Tayari, and today's guest is Reverend Dr. Eric Elnes. Exploring a diverse array of topics within the realms of spiritual inquiry and self-knowledge with Eric was truly enriching. His sensitivity, honesty, compassion, and wisdom in navigating theology and the quest for heartfelt meaning-making were truly inspiring. Reverend Dr. Eric Elnes is a nationally recognized interfaith leader and award-winning author with a PhD in biblical studies. He's known for his book, Gifts of the Darkwood, and is the former host of Darkwood Brew, a groundbreaking television program exploring faith and culture. During his ministry in Omaha, Nebraska, his congregation joined the Tri-Faith Initiative, where a Jewish synagogue, a Christian church, and an Islamic mosque co-located to a 38-acre commons to move beyond interfaith dialogue and into interfaith community. Currently, Dr. Elnes serves as an interim minister and executive director of the Eden Tree Foundation, focusing on leveraging technology for spiritual growth and interfaith exploration. He's also deeply passionate about the Christian Pluralism Project, an initiative dedicated to fostering inclusivity among Christians committed to interfaith dialogue and cooperation. If you are curious about any of my other offerings, such as the personalized threshold counseling that I offer for individuals and couples, or if you're interested in reading my latest essays, simply visit coyotecouncil.earth. You'll find a direct link in the show notes. Also, feel free to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which provides updates on new podcast episodes alongside other creative happenings. You can subscribe on our website. Now, let's wade out into the wild wisdom of Yeshua, Jesus, and unearth some gifts of the Darkwood together with Reverend Dr. Eric Elnes. So, I actually want to start this conversation off with a quote from you. Yeah, it feels like a good starting place for us because I feel like it's touching into a theme that I'm beginning to understand this project is really exploring. And so you say, quote, "You have a place in this world, a place where everything comes together in your body and you disappear into a seamless whole." And so I'm wondering if you could explore what this means for you today and what kind of guiding significance it may have for your life now.
Yeah, so how do I answer with words wordless? Something that's beyond words.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that quote comes from the first chapter of my book, Gifts of the Darkwood. And it's in kind of the dark wood of life where we often find our place in the world. It's kind of times when life offers us gifts that we don't necessarily think about as being gifts. At first, gifts like failure and uncertainty and emptiness and getting lost and these kinds of things. And so life kind of hits us, hard, and then we're forced to kind of find different patterns of living in response to those things. And oftentimes it's at those times when we're really kind of struggling to find a new way of being in light of something that's happened, that we discover kind of these what I call sweet spot moments. There are times when just something seems to kind of click, into alignment, and we're doing something, or we're considering doing something, or in the midst of something, and we just feel like, I feel more fully alive than I felt in months, and what was that? And Those sweet spot moments, I use that term because it's also a sweet spot can be found on cricket bats and tennis rackets and golf clubs and so forth. And that sweet spot, like on a tennis racket, is just off the center, and it's where the impact of the ball, when it collides with the racket, the vibrations exactly counter each other, such that the force then sending the ball forward is fully accounted for in sending that ball forward, rather than being absorbed by the racket. And so when you hit the tennis ball in the sweet spot of the racket, it feels like you've hardly hit anything at all, and yet you just sent the ball over with the most power and the most control. And I think that, just to kind of take that tennis analogy, we don't get practice at finding that sweet spot until we've not found it over and over again. Like we keep adjusting and keep adjusting styles, and suddenly, like, we're hitting it, like, this is the way of swinging that brings that about, that result. And that's the same thing in life. Oftentimes it's these challenges, and you kind of constant beating until we finally adjust to some new way of being, or just move a millimeter in our perceptions even of what is happening, and suddenly just things click, and that remember that moment, and when those moments come up, if you pay attention, they oftentimes, there's a pattern to them. There's a correspondence. It's like crumbs dropped in the forest. You could find your way crumb by crumb into a new way of being, and finding that place that feels most natural to you in the world, where you're using less effort, and yet you're actually responding to life with greater power and greater control over your own trajectory, because you're doing what's most natural to you.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Tao Te Ching. There's a line in there where it says something like to the effect of, without doing anything, everything gets done.
Yeah,
which is a difficult thing to understand. I'd be curious to hear you elaborate on that in your own way.
Well, it's funny you'd say that, because I'm a Christian, but I'm a Christian pluralist, meaning I fully embrace the path of Jesus without denying the legitimacy of other paths that God may create for humanity.
Yeah.
And get a great deal of joy in interacting with people of other faiths and learning about my own faith through theirs. And I've always said that if I weren't a Christian, I'd probably be a Taoist. So it's funny you'd pick up that same,
right.
Because there is a Taoist spirit to most everything I write, I think. At least I like to think so. But there's that concept. It's kind of related to that concept in Taoism of the uncarved block, where when you carve the block, that's what you've just locked it into some form. So you try to keep your options open as long as possible before kind of in life, before you're setting something down. And I think if you take that idea and you take the quote you just offered, it has to do with being mindful about your life and not being overly quick to define, like, this is what I'm going to be about. Really paying attention and realizing that your doing is secondary to your being. And so your being really controls and all of your doing, and your doing really has very little significance, actually, outside of your being. And that's where it kind of brings in the Buddhist slant too, which I also really appreciate, as being a little less concerned about the end results of your actions, or external, or reliant on external things happening to you in order to be happy. The less we rely on the externalities of life to make us happy, the happier we're going to be. And so it gets back again to that state of being, overdoing.
Yeah, and I see, like, the more I learn about Yeshua, Jesus, and the teachings that have been passed down around his mythic journey through life, the more I recognize how his path and what he learned and what he shared and how he showed up as a being is very Taoist. But it's very resonant with many different mystics or other mythological beings that hold a similar kind of story, in that they're touching into some kind of deeper metaphysical understanding of
Mhm.
what you're saying, of what it means to simply be a part of creation, rather than to separate oneself consciously or unconsciously from that beingness, to
Yes.
flow with the river rather than to try and stand up and fight your way back up it because you need to have this sense of control. I feel like Yeshua was consistently inviting this sense of letting go, but letting go through the heart in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely resonate with that on a number of levels. And and you mentioned the Taoist part of Jesus. Even Jesus says do not resist evil, evil one, which is interesting because we're all about like let's stand up for social justice, and I'm part of very much the social justice tradition. Like we stand and we resist, and Jesus says actually don't resist evil, but but he's not saying like bow down to evil. He's saying there are other ways to defeat evil than by punching against it. You actually there's that Taoist statement in the Tao Te Ching about how the great nation actually does not rise above the other nations, smaller nations, but actually comes under, like the water that goes down to the lowest place. And that actually by doing so, the greater nation, or the one with power, in a sense, by coming under those with less power, then it creates a situation where those with less power actually benefit from serving, from joining forces with the powerful, because their interests are being met. At the same time, the interests of the powerful are being met. I'm kind of going off track a little bit. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm following.
Oh, okay. But also that life energy, that kind of giving yourself to life. And, I think that, there's a lot of Christians who say that, who believe that, like there's Christianity and there's nothing else. And you say, well, why do you, that makes no sense. So how do you justify, the God that created the whole universe could say, okay, there's one way to me, and then they cite, John 14, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
Right.
I ask them now, is there any other statement? And they come up with nothing. I got nothing. But it's that one statement they think means it's Jesus's way or the hell way. But actually, what Jesus is indicating there is he's not talking about himself or even a religion that connects us to the divine. He's talking about a way of life. It's by this way of life that you are connected to the divine. And, happily, like when Jesus is asked, well, what is this way of life? He tells us, and it sounds so similar to what we find other reverberations in throughout the world. And yet it provides words that I wasn't able to articulate before I heard it through Jesus. He says, the most important thing, he's asked, what's the most important thing to know? He says, well, to love your Lord, your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So I call these the three great loves: love God, neighbor, and self. And oftentimes we don't think about the self part. We think, oh, it's God and neighbor, but it's actually, if you don't love your neighbor, if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, like if you don't love yourself, well, please don't love your neighbor as you love yourself, But he's talking about these three great loves that need to be practiced simultaneously. Like you can't just simply say 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So like I'll love God and myself, but not my neighbor, or God, my neighbor, not myself, But we have to have these three simultaneously. That is a huge part of our connection to God. When we have this love for a power higher than ourselves, love you as I love me. And then I think he adds, and I call those the three great loves, or the 3 G's, but he adds another G to the equation. I think just through his whole life and teachings, it's evident that grace is a huge part of his path too. Like if we can't give or receive grace, good luck connecting to the divine, and because we all need grace, because we never practice those 3 great loves in unity like we hope to, as well as we hope to. And so he's not just simply saying anything goes, but he's also saying there is a way. There is, if you have this love, that's got these multi-dimensionality to it, and you can give and receive grace. That is that's what connects us to our higher source. And you can find this in so many paths throughout the world. Then you think, well, is it any wonder? I mean, if a God who truly loves the world, why wouldn't God create about as many paths as there are people? Who can follow that to the divine. And again, that's not to simply say anything goes. I mean, if you're going to hate your neighbor, you're going to kill people and so forth, good luck connecting.
Exactly.
But, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well, and that statement, I am the way, in
mhm,
that, from what I understand, he's also saying, because I am the way, you are the way.
mm,
Because he recognizes the other as himself, and he
mhm,
recognizes himself as creator, meaning
mhm,
that he has the power of creation within. He's been bestowed that like all other beings have, us
mhm,
being like just fragments of the divine,
mhm,
carrying that spark within us. So
mhm,
him saying I am the way is actually inviting us to recognize that we are the way, and that by
mhm,
tapping into our real authentic nature, our
mhm,
divine nature, then we will know what we're here to do, and
mhm,
that we will know others also as as ourselves or aspects of the divine as well. And so
mhm,
then those kind of moral codes become naturally arise, as well
mhm,
as our actions, like that Taoist phrase of like we were just talking, where it's everything is done without needing to do anything. It's like there's this natural arising of understanding what I'm meant to do in this moment
mhm,
because of recognizing the divine creative source within.
mhm,
And it got me thinking about like when Yeshua goes into the temple, I think in Jerusalem, and starts throwing the tables and stuff and yelling, someone might see that as being like contradictory, which he held oppositions so beautifully, I think,
mhm.
right? Like and contradicted himself in many different moments, that being a really like obvious one, right? Like suddenly this peaceful being is throwing things around, but if you don't understand the kind of deeper aspects of what we're speaking to right now, which is that your natural movement in the world will arise when you're connected to the divine within, that you'll respond to the moment and give the moment what it needs because of the deep listening in which you're inhabiting, you know.
Mhm.
And so in that moment, it's like he knew that that was needed in that moment, even though he's this bringer of peace,
Mhm.
that sometimes there is some kind of I don't want to say violence, but there's some kind of like action that can almost be perceived as violence that is necessary in order to bring more truth to the moment. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah, yeah. There's a number of thoughts I have about that. One is like what immediately comes to mind is what we learned from, for instance, Black liberationist movement in the United States and so forth. That that since there's no peace without justice, and so you call something peace, but that doesn't just mean like let's have some warm fuzzies. Sometimes you have to topple some tables in order to achieve true peace. And I think that and we tend to look at Jesus's actions as if he's tried to teach something that persists for all time. Like what he's not teaching us that we should always be turning the tables. Or is it like you're kind of noting there's a time and place for doing that? And I think that Jesus was not crucified for having a basic statement like, hey, stay out of trouble and be nice. He knew. I don't fall. I don't personally subscribe to the idea that God had to kill Jesus in order for salvation to happen or us to be forgiven and so
Yeah.
forth. I think we killed Jesus, and Jesus was aware of what was coming after him, and he knew he was going to die, and so but wasn't going to die without people noticing. Like he's going to, if you're going to kill me, I'm going to make sure as many people know this is happening as possible and get the message that I brought with it. So of course he enters Jerusalem and he's toppling the tables because he's really making a statement about he's really, in a sense, implying that his movement transcends the authority of the high priest,
Right.
and so in fact if they so that really gets the authorities riled up and puts him very much on their radar and the Roman radar as well, and so yeah, people were paying attention. So yeah, Jesus is a little feisty when he gets to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
He tells the hardest parables, and he's calling out people, and why
Yeah.
wouldn't you be? He's calling it for what it is.
Yeah.
But
There's
that
a
but I will say, if I could just add one more thing, I always look at all of Jesus's angry statements, and they always seem to have this quality, not like of condemning somebody. It's like, hey, you're better than this. You are capable of so much better. Like I believe in you. So why are you acting so small in the world?
yeah. Right.
That
Right.
that seems to be the tenor and tone of his angry statements.
Yeah, a fierce grace.
Yes, yeah, fierce grace. Yeah,
And is necessary because life is inherently fierce. And
yeah,
there's a grace in that too, as you're
right.
speaking to. I want to shift gears a little bit. And I want to bring up two quotes and then explore them with you. One
Okay.
of them is from Rainer Rilke, who
Oh
I'm sure
yeah.
you've heard of. And then another is by Carl Jung.
Okay.
And so Rainer says, "Yet, no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence." And Carl Jung says, "Modern man can't see God because he doesn't look low enough."
Hmm.
And so I'm wondering how you might interpret this notion of a dark God,
Hmm.
and how does it resonate with your understanding of spiritual heart and a divine presence in moments of uncertainty, peril, and darkness. And then additionally, like Carl Jung's observation highlights the importance of looking low enough, as he says, to perceive
Hmm.
God. So what do you imagine he's speaking to, and how can we begin to cultivate such a depth of perception?
Yeah.
That.
Those are good quotes. Yeah, and I definitely that's you haven't turned low enough is so true. It's like if you're gonna get your ego up too high, I mean to the extent that you raise your ego is the extent that you're missing God all the time. It seems like, and yeah, the dark thing is a place where I've spent a lot of time and thought, and especially worked out in my book Gift of the Dark Woods, because that book was a direct reference to Dante when he talks about in his Commedia, the Divine Comedy. Dante had this horrible crisis in his life, and he writes, in the middle of my life's journey, I awakened in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost.
Wow.
Where the true way was wholly lost, and
Mm.
Dante kind of saw the Darkwood negatively. He saw it as kind of this bad place to be. Like, if you find yourself in the Darkwood, get out as fast as you can. There's bad monsters in there and so forth. But the mystics in Christianity and also in other religions have always understood the darkness, the Darkwood, or that kind of darkness that surrounds the divine, as a place of blessing, not terror. I mean, it can be terrifying, but ultimately a blessing, not curse.
Right.
And that it's in life's struggles that we seem to grow fastest, and in a most profound way toward our higher self and toward the divine. I don't think it's any coincidence, for instance, that the name Israel, Jacob was renamed Israel. Israel means one who struggles with God, one who struggles with God. And Islam, one of their key principles is jihad, which is not about warfare. It's actually about the inner struggle, in life. And Jesus made struggle to be a center point of his message too. I mean, all three of these Abrahamic faiths are united in the struggle. There's a curious line it's the first words out of Jesus's mouth of teaching in the Gospel of Matthew, and the very first words of teaching in the Gospel of Mark. They're basically the same. Jesus says, repent. The kingdom of heaven has drawn near, or the kingdom of God, depending on which gospel you're reading. Kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God has drawn near. Repent and believe the good news. And that's typically taken in circles as like, okay, God's about to come. Look busy, because if you get your act together, beat yourself up, tell God how bad you are, because otherwise there'll be hell to pay, literally. But if you look underneath the surface and actually read the Greek, there's a very, very different understanding underneath those words. For instance, that word that's translated "has drawn near" actually is a verb that implies something that's happened in the past that has present significance. So the better translation would be that the kingdom of heaven, or God's realm, is already here. Not it's coming, It's here already. And then that word repent is metanoia in Greek, which is not beat yourself up, feel how bad you are. It's literally repent. Metanoia literally means just simply a complete change of thought. So if you're going to put this together, hey, friends, heaven or God's realm is already here. Change your whole way of thinking and believe the good news. And you can imagine Jesus's first century audience, just like our audience would be saying, what, are you smoking crack, Jesus? I mean, there's warfare, there's poverty, there's depression. I'm depressed, or there's death. And, how can you possibly say that the realm of God is, here? And he's not denying that it's later also, but he's saying it's full enough present here. You need to be paying attention. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that the very next words of teaching out of Jesus's mouth comes in Matthew chapter 4 in the Gospel of Matthew, where he's preaching his famous Sermon on the Mount, which begins with what's known as the Beatitudes statements, the blessed be statements. And it's like he's going down the list of every objection that people could offer for why heaven can't be experienced here. It must be experienced later, and just crossing it out. Like, you say you're poor in spirit, you're blessed. You say you're mourning the death of a loved one, you're blessed. You say you're being persecuted, you're blessed. You say you're hungering and thirsting for righteousness, which is nowhere apparent, you're blessed. On down the line he goes, until finally, if you're going to actually take Jesus seriously and accept that heaven can be found in the here and now, as opposed to simply the later, you have to change your definition of what an experience of heaven or God's realm would even be. So many times we define like a heavenly experience as absence of struggle. Oh, wow, that was so often. Everything was going for me. Like, there was no problems. That was so heavenly. But that's not Jesus's definition of a heavenly experience, apparently. I mean, that would include that. But if you're going to take Jesus seriously about all these blessed be statements, you have to define an experience of heaven. Actually, you have to be able to find heaven in the heart of your struggles, not merely in their absence. And we know more and more, especially I think from near-death experiences. There's been tons of study on near-death experiences now, and some common themes linking them together. And I've been studying them more and more in the last few years. And one of the common themes, well, first of all, is like you discover people who've done this experience a complete oneness and a sense of being loved beyond their wildest imagination. But also, people have, there's a number of people who kind of have an opportunity to kind of ask, why is there so much trouble in the world? Why is there evil? And why is, all this stuff? And there's this answer that seems to consistently come back that this realm we inhabit is kind of like a training ground. And it's like weight training. If you go to the gym, you pick up weights, and why do you pick up weights? It's because they create resistance, that you have to then work against, and why do you do that? Well, because it builds up your muscle. Well, these hard things that happen to us in life, they're essentially the world's weights, and so we're meant to be here to actually have those wonderful, bright, sunny, stress-free moments for sure that give us a little taste of something beautiful. But we're also here to struggle and to find that taste of beauty in those darker moments. And when you think about it, like if you're just like in some sort of heavenly realm where nothing happens, like nothing, like let's say I'm a really good well, you take this life. Like let's say there's no such thing as somebody who has a perfect life. There's no such thing as somebody who doesn't struggle. But just imagine, like if you were in a household where you were born to perfectly loving parents, you had all the money you ever needed, you never wanted for anything, and now you consider yourself to be a good and just person. Well, when has that ever been tested?
Yeah.
How do you know? Like, what if you didn't have enough food to eat, or what if you didn't, if you had abusive parents, or what? I mean, how do you know you'd be a good person? You wouldn't, because you've never been tested. You've never had to build those muscles. It's only been, in the easiest, level of the game, in a sense,
Yeah.
And that's kind of like playing a game. It's like these video games. You play the video game. Why? Not to win the video game. You play the video game in order to level up. And what you do when you level up is you get more challenged. you get that level, then you level up to even greater challenge.
Mhm.
So I have the feeling that some of us that have had the greatest challenges in our life, people think, "Oh, God, did God hate me? Is God punishing me?" It's like, no, probably because you're a spiritual giant and you came here for some real heavy lifting. You're on level 27, and I'm on level 5.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I had some really difficult moments in my life and in my younger years, big challenges, and I see how they led me to, um, I guess the opportunity that I then chose to um, go into, but it was the opportunity to cultivate like a deeper well of compassion, to open my heart in a more wholesome and inviting and receptive way to the darkness of life, to the pain of life, which then, like these days, what I'm doing mostly for work is I'm holding therapeutic spaces with people. It's counsel work, and I notice that like I'm with people in some really as they explore some really dark aspects of their life, some really challenging things that have happened to them or that are happening to them. And I just noticed that my capacity to hold them in it and to not feel like I'm being thrown around by their experience, but to just recognize myself and the humanity in their journey, and to just hold it tenderly and to feel it. Like this week, I actually cried with 3 of my clients because I can feel the depth and the tenderness of how difficult life is, like really. And I've been there myself in so many different ways. And I see that as a gift to be able to hold someone in that tenderness and to actually feel it and know it for myself. And then, you know what I mean? It's a tremendous, that is one of the gifts of the Darkwood for me, of being able to then bestow that level of presence and that depth of heart onto the moment and to another human being, which allows them to feel actually seen and understood and heard, maybe for the first time in their life. At least it's a significant moment for them that can then offer some kind of refuge to be able to truly unfurl into, you know.
Yeah, so I'm sure that you as a counselor, somebody who counsels others, and know that that's critical to be able to empathize, find some sort of cord of empathy within you. Even if you haven't had that exact same experience, likely you can find a cord within you that's been hurt in a way that resonates with that experience. It's just so vitally important to like showing up for the person and being present for the person. And I'm sure you probably also have found as somebody who counsels others then too, that just as important for the counselor anyway, is the ability to then let go of this other person's problem. Like what, you're fully present when you're with them, you're feeling 100% of everything you can feel. And when they've left, that's clear that their problems remain their problems and yours remain yours. Theirs do not become yours and keep building upon yours.
Right.
That's a delicate art.
It is a delicate art, but I also see how my difficult experiences in life have also gifted me that ability in some ways too, because I can see how I've experienced things, I've integrated them and made it through. And here I am, and I still have challenges, and I still have remnants and shrapnel from those experiences that come up in certain moments. But I feel a deep level of understanding about who I am and my place in the world. And so then I can see in my client or in anyone that like I can trust that their process is actually for them, and that they have the inner strength to hold it all if they allow themselves to go there, if they have the courage to go to the depths that are necessary to unearth that kind of strength, And so that allows me to let go of it, because I can see almost like the wisdom in it all, or the divine intelligence in it all, that they're in this process of cultivating actually greater capacities to know themselves and to know their spirit, to know God, and however they perceive that. But I wanted to speak to this sense of heaven and hell in the now. When you were speaking to it, I was reminded of both one of the most powerful teachings and images, stories that I know of Yeshua's journey, but also then of this other book I read, and this man who I'm forgetting the name of him, but I want to speak to him first. So the book's called The Devils of Loudon. It was written by Aldous Huxley, and it's this exploration of this intense time in French history where there was this really dark cultural meme, like cultural virus, that was causing people to persecute others as being witches. And like so many people were being persecuted, and it turned into this thing where if you didn't like your neighbor because of whatever reason, you could say they're a witch and make up all kinds of things, and they would maybe be, you know, put in jail or murdered. You know, it was a really serious thing. And so this book is exploring that, but it explores it through the lens of this one man's story. And of course, it's this long, drawn-out story, but it gets to this point where he is eventually brought to trial, and he is seen as being like a sorcerer. And so he's put to death, but put to death through torture. And one of the ways that they would torture these people is they would bind their legs with wooden boards, both of their legs, right? So wooden boards on either side of their legs. And then they would smash wedges into this contraption with a hammer. And so each wedge that went in, it would bring the boards closer until your legs were completely shattered or made liquid, right? And so they were doing this to this man. And the whole time, of course, he's trying to avoid being persecuted, being killed for being a sorcerer, because he isn't. He was just this kind of scandalous dude who got in trouble in his community. But at the end, when his legs are being turned into liquid, there's these accounts of people who are in the process of witnessing him, and he embodies Christ at the end of his life, in that he looks up at the people who are torturing him with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face, and he looks at them and he keeps saying over and over again, "I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you."
Powerful.
And of course, at the end of Yeshua's life, he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they've done." After he's been impaled and he's been humiliated and tortured and he's dying, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they've done." And to me, that is heaven. So this struggle and this challenge to understand, like, how could this possibly be heaven? There's so much darkness in the world. There's so much pain. There's so much suffering. That is heaven. Being able to forgive the people who are liquefying your legs, to be able to forgive the people who are impaling you and hanging you up on a cross and humiliating you, and to not just say it, but to know it, to embody it, to become forgiveness. Like, that's heaven on earth. Well, how could you go deeper?
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that, and that's what I actually had an experience a couple of years ago of severe abuse towards me, and which resulted in me leaving a position I was in without even a job to go to, because it would be unsafe to go back to it. And yeah, it was a very traumatic time, and it made me question whether I still wanted to be in ministry, and it made me question whether I was still Christian. And yeah, it involved, a bunch of therapy and walks in the woods and hot spring soaks and meditation and so forth. And I never actually turned a corner. I mean, I was making some progress, but felt like this. I still felt this amount of rage that was really disturbing to me, because it was like infinite rage. I could not see an end to my rage and the hurt that I was feeling, and I just couldn't quite get on top of that, no matter how much hiking and hot spring soaking and therapy and so forth I was doing, until I was driving home from one of these hikes along the Columbia River Gorge one day, and actually I had that very thought of Jesus on the cross saying, "You Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." And I was contemplating that, and was realized that, part of what got me into the Christian thing to begin with was the acceptance that his prayer wasn't just for his own crucifiers, which it was, which is amazing to me, isn't it? I mean, like the worst thing you'd possibly do is like kill God's own Messiah. The worst sin you could possibly commit would be to torture and kill this one person. And he's praying, "Father, forgive them, for they know what they're doing." And if Jesus, like, I don't believe that Jesus was God, so to speak, other than more than you and I are God in that way. But I do believe he was a very high level being, and I think the Son of God is a great metaphor for what he is.
Right.
I mean, he is an ascended master. He is an amazing, the soul. But most importantly, whether you believe he's God or not, I think what anybody who really looks at him, well, not anybody, but I guess what I would say about Jesus most fully is that he reveals the heart of God's heart. He reveals something essential about God. So if Jesus is praying this prayer, to me, that tells me that he expects God to act on that prayer. And that's fully in conformity with God's own heart, that God would forgive the very people who's tortured and killed, God's own, metaphorical son. And that prayer then is not just for them, but it's for all of us. That there's literally nothing we can do in this life that ultimately can separate us from God's love and ability to come back, to turn around and come back to God. And I realized that, so what got me into Christianity was accepting that for myself. So like I say, I don't think that God had to kill Jesus and shed Jesus' blood to wash me clean of my sin, but I do believe his prayer on the cross indicates what God's heart is towards my sin and my brokenness and all the ways I've hurt myself and I've hurt other people, all that forgive him, for he's an idiot. And he doesn't know what he's doing, and I've accepted that. And so that's a huge weight. And I realized that, okay, I have been forgiven and a lifetime full of brokenness by my own creator. And here's this person who abused me for this limited time of life. Like, I'm like a very rich man, and here's a person who owes me a debt, a very small debt comparatively. And I've been forgiving this huge debt, and I can't forgive the smaller one. Like, and I realized, so then I actually let go and I forgave this person who had abused me. And I forgave the leadership of my church that had tried to just ignore the issue and pretend like it never happened. And I did that not because I felt bad. It's actually because I felt great. It's like I reclaimed my own forgiveness and my own state of relationship with God. It's like, yeah, I'm really a wealthy person. I can write this. This is a rounding error. I can write that off. And so, I realized at that moment, I realized, okay, I'm still Christian. It still speaks to me because of the forgiveness thing, which is present in other faiths too, but just is how I found it in my own faith. And I do think, though, that I always want to clarify, though, when it comes to forgiveness, there's kind of two ways to forgive, because the best form of forgiveness is that forgiveness restores relationship to wholeness between two people. But that involves the other person who's done the harm, repenting or changing their whole way of thinking, and trying to make amends, stopping the behavior. And so I would never counsel somebody who's like in an abusive relationship to simply forgive their abuser while they're still in that relationship and can still be abused. Because if that person hasn't turned, all you're doing is siding with evil. All you're doing is enabling evil. And so I was able to forgive because I was no longer in relationship to this person. So what I was really doing is letting go of any debt he owed me. If there's karma, I'm letting go of any karmic debt he owed, or anything like that for myself. But ultimately, the most beautiful form would be if this abuser would ever realize, oh, I really kind of messed up here. And then it would be the greatest joy to have the fullest kind of forgiveness and say, hey, we're good. We're good. Let's be in relationship again.
Yeah, and it frees up energy within your own body and being, heart and soul, to then, rather than like holding on to this pain and this sense of that there's a debt owed to you, by releasing that for real,
Yeah.
You're now opening yourself up to more creative energy, more creative flow, more loving energy, which can then be gifted upon other people. But then you're also releasing them of it too, because when we hold other people in those kinds of debts, whether they consciously feel it or not, we are really restricting them even in some ways.
Yes.
By releasing that, we then offer them, there's some kind of invitation in that for them to then be welcomed into a new way, whether they know it or not. You talk about the soul as having a native buoyancy, like a rubber ball underwater that yearns to rise. And throughout your book, you explore the possibility of, quote, finding your place in this world at the very point where you feel furthest from it. And so I'm wondering, like, how can soulful individuals remember and re-enliven this innate sense of resilience while traversing the deep, dark, thick of life?
Yeah. That was just, and it's going to be different for every person. And there's so much to say on that.
Of course.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. I think to me, well, it comes down, see how I can say this most briefly. This will sound like an aside, like it's off to the point, beside the point, but it's not. I had an experience back in 1981 that actually got me into ministry. I was going to be a solar energy research scientist, and then I and a friend both had a profoundly mystical experience of the divine that convinced us beyond any shadow of doubt that there is a God, and that this God somehow is far more aware of us than we're aware of us.
Right.
And because of that awareness, and despite that awareness, this God loves us all without any exception whatsoever, beyond our wildest imagination. And that set me on the path to ministry. Then the ongoing reverberations of that originally intuition experience has kept me, on this path. And I think that the best way I could describe it, like when I get really down, and what helps me is to remember that if I see the world and all I can see is darkness, I am actually under some sort of illusion. I'm in Maya. I'm not seeing clearly, because the most clear I've ever seen in my entire life was in those moments in 1981 where it was infinitely bright, infinitely loving, and infinitely okay. Like even the crap that happens to us, ultimately, in the whole great scheme of things, it's all okay. All will be reconciled. All will be forgiven. All will be, righted. Every tear will be wiped away. I mean, that it truly is. And in eternity, there is no sense of time. So this is true now, even though we don't experience it in the now. But at some point in reality, there is no such thing as time and space. It's an illusion in and of itself. So that reality is ever present. And so now, since we are stuck in time and space, though we do, have these sucky moments in life, it's helpful for me to remember to the extent that I think life is just a drag and it's not worth living, or it's, what have you. I am actually, I am not resonating with reality. That, with a capital R, that and so I need to keep looking and finding those angles, those ways of understanding my own story or your story, what have you, the world story, until I could find some sort of rightness, and affirm, no, actually things are much better than they appear. It's almost like, I know the poet David White had a great analogy of this long ago, resonated with me. He talks about how, the cycles of the moon, we all see the moon, and we've seen it at fullness, but we've also seen it when it's a half moon and a quarter moon and just the thumbnail, and we've seen it when it goes away. Well, but when it goes away, when it's darkness, we know the moon is still there. And when there's even just a thin sliver, we know the full moon is still there, and so in those darker periods, it's just important to remember, there is this full moon there. There is light and life in this world. And to refuse to accept any story, any interpretation of your life or your circumstances that does not take into account that light and life as the ultimate reality.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Thank you for that. Mm. So in your exploration of the dark wood in your book, you explore 7 gifts,
Mm-hmm.
including uncertainty, emptiness,
Mm-hmm.
being thunderstruck, getting lost, temptation,
Mm-hmm.
disappearing,
Mm-hmm.
and misfits.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, could you share which of these gifts, whether it's one of them or a couple of them, that
Mm-hmm.
have touched your heart the most profoundly over time? And
Sure.
perhaps describing like maybe some kind of personal experience or insight that made that so resonant, so deeply
Yeah.
resonant with you.
Sure. Maybe I would, if I pick 2, I'd pick the gift of uncertainty and the gift of temptation.
Okay. Great. Yeah.
So uncertainty is something that none of us feel comfortable with. I mean, we all want this like wide open freedom to life, but then we all kind of want to know what our next step is, and the next step beyond that, hopefully, just at least a few steps out. And
Yep.
then those are all wiped away. We get very anxious, very, very quickly, and usually that happens because we are storytellers at heart. All of us tell at least one story to ourselves continually, and that is the story of our own life. Like, why am I here in this place at this time doing this thing? Like, who am I? What am I about? We have this story we tell ourselves about who we are and why we are, and we just keep telling that. Well, inevitably, something comes along that hits us in a certain way that makes that story we've told ourselves, it challenges that. Like, well, wait a minute. If this is true, then what just happened to you is unexplainable. And so either you've got to like put your head in the sand and just deny this thing ever happened that contradicts your story, or in the face of so much uncertainty, that uncomfortableness of uncertainty that this event has caused you, you've got to search for a larger story that encompasses that whatever happened to you, and includes that. And so really fundamentally, uncertainty causes us to keep looking for larger and larger stories that eventually become large enough for us to actually live with freedom. And because our temptation is always to tell a smaller story about ourselves, to the point where we're just completely, we're constricted and bound and enslaved, and so it is those things, the uncertainty actually, that actually helps us broaden that story. And I think one of the things that I guess probably hit me most, one of the biggest things that hit me on a personal level was when in 2008, I moved from Scottsdale, Arizona to Omaha, Nebraska to serve a new congregation. And we were just moving into our dream house in Omaha. And my eldest daughter had a fainting spell. And we brought her actually into the ER, and they diagnosed her with a brain tumor, which turned out to be cancerous. And so here it was, this like pinnacle experience of life. You're going to this new congregation and dream home, and like, oh wow, life is, I finally found that place in life where, life is just going great, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly, like, oh, your daughter, and by the way, your eldest daughter has a cancerous brain tumor.
Wow.
And yeah, that was a huge hit. One of the biggest challenges any of us have ever faced in terms of, intersecting with our story, interrupting our story and challenging it, and challenging God's goodness, challenging the goodness of life and justice and all these things. And but I will say that was in 2008. And by the way, my oldest daughter is doing very well. She still has a brain tumor.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah, you can't ever take it out. But she's doing quite well, and has never. But that was a long time ago. And looking back on now, having all this experience, like that just felt like life was over for us, and like, how could life ever be good, especially if you've got ongoing presence of a brain tumor? But it just forced us to look at life in different ways, and not just to kind of like, can I say, make up shit, just to feel good, like, I mean, really look at life in ways that you could trust. And so like one of the very early benefits of that experience was that we, like as parents, my wife and I realized that if we are constantly worried about our daughter's health and existence, we will always be like over the top stressed. And that's not going to do us any good. And it's certainly not going to do our daughter any good, to have constantly stressed out parents. And so we discovered a way of moving in the world that now applies to all levels of life for me and her. That is, we came up with this principle: never worry about anything until it presents itself to be worried about. So, my daughter has an MRI every 3 to 6 months. Between those MRIs, we're not going to worry about her having a brain tumor. Now, I will say about the day before the MRI, we get a little nervous again. We're human. But that allows us to live life without the fear of that, and not constantly contemplating what it could be if our daughter, her health were to turn south, and to fully then embrace our daughter, without that, because if we were all worried, we'd be holding back on our emotions. We're like, how could I love this daughter fully? Because it's going to hurt me so badly, So no, we can love her fully, and we do. And we've also, and she would say this too, for all of us, it has created a depth dimension to life that is just extraordinary. Like we definitely, like, it's made her more intentional about her path in life, because you never know what the future could hold. And every time we see it, we never end a conversation without saying, I love you, ever, And so it makes us so much more intentional in life. And a couple of years ago, we were kind of reflecting on what this impact has been. And I realized suddenly that if it weren't for the death, the possibility of death part, the presence of her brain tumor has only ever provided benefits to our life, because it's forced us to live life in this way, that we wouldn't have naturally. And it's come to all kinds of other insights, about how to live a meaningful life despite the ongoing presence of the possibility of death, that makes it very hard for us to be afraid of most anything. And so the death part still sucks. I wish that wasn't there. But like, if we knew for a fact that, my daughter would live to a ripe old age, we'd be just looking at this whole thing saying, wow, this was fucking great.
Right.
Pardon my French.
Oh, no, it's all good. Yeah, no. Yeah, and I wonder how much death is actually an advisor in this experience too. That of course, to imagine, it's got to be one of the most painful things to imagine, and yet at the same rate, there's this gift that death offers us by inviting us more fully into life. Have you had that sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's probably the biggest benefit, is that it really does invite you to live life to its fullest at all times, not to delay joy too terribly far. Sometimes it's beneficial to delay joy, but not for very long. And I will say too that even though the death part sucks, there's a peace I have with that peace. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm at peace with my own daughter's death. Like, I would never wish that to happen. But I'm at peace with my own death, and therefore I'm at peace with everybody else's death on some level too. I mean, I really do believe that we live on. I have no notion whatsoever that some people are punished in hell for eternity and other people go on to some sort of paradise. I think we all, however, whatever the afterlife offers, it's under the love and grace of God. We're all protected in that fashion. So I don't have any worries about that for anybody, including myself. So it's not life. This life is, to me, is a very toned down version of what fullness awaits. It's probably some sort of evolutionary thing. And my guess is, like, we will continue to live and die into hopefully higher and higher resonances, until maybe one day, this is just me speculating and me kind of wishfully thinking, but maybe one day we'll actually live on Earth the way we're supposed to live on this earth. I don't need to be like floating around with angels and playing harps. Like, just give me the frickin' earth and even uncertainty and even natural disasters and all that. As long as we're like not killing each other, we're not stealing from each other, we're loving each other, we're actually living the way we were intended to be. Like, wow, give me I'll live and die 1,000 lifetimes on this plane before I move on to some other ethereal place.
I fully agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in that sense. Well, I do want to mention that you did say that you might want to explore temptation as
Oh
well.
yeah.
So maybe we can come back to that, because just
Yeah.
on what you were just saying, I'm thinking like, and maybe this is connected too to exploring temptation, but it seems like your approach to coming into a greater intimacy with your spiritual heart, or your spiritual evolution, awakening, that you seem to prioritize experience and exploration over dogma and doctrine.
Definitely.
And I imagine that there seems to be some kind of like orientation toward the simple and the practical in what I hear you, in how you're exploring the inevitable difficulties and challenges and beauties and just the life journey. And so maybe you can connect that into exploring the gift of temptation. I don't know, but
Sure.
those two things I'm curious about.
Well, I can't tell you much. It warms my heart to say that, to hear you say that to reflect it that way, that I can say in simple terms, because I think that my natural tendency is to overthink things, but I'm a preacher, so I have to, I'm forced every week to make sure it's stated as simply and as concisely as possible.
I understand.
But yeah. So I think that temptation, and the kind of temptation that I think that is interesting to me, is not like, are you tempted, drug, sex, and rock and roll, or something like that. Right. It's not the temptations that are like you overtly know are wrong. Oh, I'm going to steal all this money, or I'm going to kill my boss. I mean, very few of us. I mean, there are people who are seriously tempted by like extreme evil and stuff like that. But bottom line, very few of us are tempted to literally kill somebody, or and steal a whole lot of money. There are people, but the average person isn't. What we are tempted by far more easily is the temptation to do good, but the good that's not ours to do. It's the wrong good. So it might be the right good for somebody else to do, but not for us to do. Right. Because for us, it would take us off our path. It would take us out of that sweet spot. We'd always be missing that sweet spot if we keep doing that, that thing. And so we are far tempted. Like, people will guilt us in, oh, don't you care? I mean, won't you get involved in this cause, or all this path? What are, like, aren't you a caring person? Like, do you have a heart? And at some point you say, yes, I do have a heart. Thank you very much. But that's not my path. There are other people who are far better at doing that and get far more joy out of doing that than I ever would. And so it has to do with we're really called to follow those sweet spot moments, to find that way of being in the world, our place in the world, and in a sense stay in our lane. I mean, in the sense of like, practice that and trust that God is great enough and the universe is great enough to find other people who can, you don't have to solve all the issues of the world. You'll never be able to. So what is the one issue you could help solve? And you're not even going to solve it. Like, what is the issue you could, like, toss a pebble in, the pond to help solve? That's what you should be about. And so, and I'm constantly tempted, especially as a Christian minister. I mean, I get an email from somebody practically every other day saying, hey, can you sign this, or can you get involved in this cause, or can you do this and this. And I finally had to say, there are like two things I'm really good at, and I'm going to do those. So that if anybody asks me to get involved in this cause or this cause, I'll say yes all the time if I possibly can, but I'm going to say no to everything else. And yeah, you can call me heartless, but that's your problem, not mine, if I've said no to you. And it comforts me to know, because we're all tempted by that, aren't we? I mean, all the time, tempted by doing a good thing that will absolutely sap us from any kind of energy that's real, will completely get us off from doing anything that will sustain our interest or make use of our best efforts. And to me, it's comforting to know that Jesus himself was tempted by by the same thing. I mean, that was Jesus's hardest problem. When he goes into the wilderness after being baptized, it said he was led into the wilderness, and then the Satan, that in Hebrew, Satan means the adversary or the accuser, and he was given these three temptations. And the first one was to turn bread out of stone into bread. Now, this was not just simply like, hey, Jesus, you want to have a a nice meal. I mean, if he's fasted 40 days, this guy's a spiritual giant. If he doesn't want to eat, he's not going to eat. That's not going to tempt him. What's the temptation is to use his energies to feed the world, to devote himself entirely to feeding the world. Well, isn't that a good thing? Like, Jesus, don't you care? Well, there's all kinds of starving people in the world, right? Don't you care? The Satan, the accuser, that is trying to get him to do something good, but that would divert his energies from what he's called to do. And so he says, no. Then the next temptation is what? If you just bow down to me, I will give you control over all the kingdoms of the world because they're mine. And so the temptation isn't for some ego trip. Hey, I'm going to be the president of Israel, or the leader, or the dictator. It's really having the ultimate political power. And my God, wouldn't it be great if in next year's election, it was in the United States, it was Biden, Trump, or Jesus? Yeah. Oh, well, that'd be great. I know who I'd vote for. Wouldn't it be great if Jesus were making the laws instead of us? So think of all the hardship he could avert. Think of all the social justice he can enact if he had ultimate political power. But again, Jesus fed people in his ministry. He exercised political power, but that's not what his specific calling was. And so the next temptation is that what? You jump down off the temple and let the angels save you to prove that you're the Messiah. So basically base your whole ministry on doing these cheap parlor tricks so that everybody's convinced that you're God's Messiah. Base your ministry on miracles only, and he performed miracles too, but did he base his whole ministry on that? No, he was called, to be the Messiah of the Jewish people, and to live in a way that demonstrated the fullness of God's heart, not just individual pieces of that, and probably to teach us something about, as we've been talking about, forgiveness and grace, and so again, he practiced all three of those things, but he didn't focus his whole life on those things, and that was what the ultimate temptation was. So,
right.
And I think if that's tempting to Jesus, and I'm not nearly the spiritual giant Jesus is, it's probably even more of a temptation for me to do the wrong good.
Yeah. Wow. That's such a incredible reorientation toward doing good. If we can really invite that into our lives and integrate it, because it can be incredibly freeing too, right? Because I think that so many of us can feel really bogged down by this. It comes from this pure place of deeply feeling the world and wanting to do good, but it becomes hijacked by maybe, I guess, not knowing ourselves fully, by societal stories and expectations, by other people telling us what are the best things to do, rather than going deep within and listening and having the patience, really, and the deep presence to be able to hear, like, what is my unique calling, because that's ultimately why I'm here. And you mentioned how Jesus went out into the wilderness, and I recall that he would often go out into the wilderness or out into wild spaces in order to contemplate and to take space and to hollow out, as the indigenous people of the plains would say, to become the hollow bone, to receive the purity of God's wisdom, which really resides within his own heart. And so I'm in that way, and in many of the other things that we've been exploring through this conversation, to me it seems clear that Jesus, Yeshua, was this wild man, that he really was a representative of the wild, not in some kind of savage kind of sense, of course, but in this way of he was between worlds. He was domesticated in some ways, and that he was of the world. He showed up in community, and he was here to serve within the pale of society, but he also made sure to go beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And in that way, he was kind of a trickster too, like Rote, he would go beyond the pale because he knew that that's where the wild powers resided, and he would charge up and then come back and be able to act from that place of power that can respond to the needs of the moment, that isn't so swayed by society, isn't
Yes.
so swayed by what other people think is best, but it's a deeper knowing. There's a wild wisdom in his heart.
Definitely.
I'm curious what you have to say around that, and
Yeah.
to tag on to what you like. I'm naming this project Wild Heart Revival.
Okay.
So I'd be curious for you to explore alongside your thoughts around Jesus as being a wild man and being connected to his wild nature and his wild heart. What does it mean to you, this sense of this story of reviving one's wild heart?
Sure. Yeah. And I would say that Jesus was highly disciplined, but untamed. You know?
Yeah.
And it was back to his disciplines that I think allowed him to be most wild. In that respect too. So I definitely relate to that. You know, there's no taming Jesus. There's no controlling him. And again, he did not die on a cross to teach us to, you know, just be nice to others and stay out of trouble. You know, but to really love so deeply that it becomes that it goes beyond even ethics and culturally understood, you know, correct behavior and conventionality. I'll never forget when I was just going into ministry. I had my pastoral mentor told me a couple of stories about what it's like to be a minister, and one of them just like terrified me on this level. It has to do with this wildness that you're talking about, but it's a very uncomfortable. But you know, this wildness it's wonderful to think like wild, I'm free and like that, but it's also like a very uncomfortable. It can put you in a very uncomfortable spot. There was a time when he had there was a woman who had her husband died in a plane crash, and he went then to go to her house to comfort her, and she'd been grieving for a few days and just was in terrible grief, and he pulled up to her house and he said, you know, I just had this intuition, this visual image in my mind, even like to make her angry at me. Like he's like, and he fought that, like, oh, wait a minute, no, I'm here to make a comforting pastoral call. But this intuition just kept circling around and got more and more intense as he kept trying to push it away, to the point where he could see her in his mind's eye, like throwing dishes at her. Like that's whatever this force within him was trying to compel him to do, is like make her really upset. It's like I'll lose my job. Like what? This made no sense whatsoever. So he goes into her house and he has tea with her and he comforts her, and he absolutely does not follow that impulse at all, and leaves. Well, a month later, she was committed to a mental institution, and that grief that she was had become such a deep spiral. She just started having suicidal ideations and all kinds of stuff. And he looked back on that, realizing, what if I would have actually allowed her to like vent all of her emotions right on me, like taking it all in? You know, it's like I might have been fired by my church, but this woman would have maybe had a little bit of peace, you know. And I thought, wow, this God I'm following is dangerous. this spirit I'm trying to follow, you know, what if I'm ever, you know, led to feel like I'm being invited into behavior that my community might not feel is, you know, is correct. And sure enough, time and time again, I have been. But I found when I follow that impulse, it benefits not only me, but the community itself. So
tell me more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, one example that comes immediately in mind was when I started getting I was in Omaha, Nebraska, and there was this thing called the Tri-Faith Initiative, where a mosque, an Islamic mosque, a Jewish synagogue, and a Christian church were all going to buy property together and move onto that property, build separate worship facilities and a common center to kind of move beyond interfaith dialogue into interfaith community. And I didn't even know about this initiative when I moved to Omaha, and they told me about it. I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. I can't believe my good luck to be in Omaha, Nebraska, where I could witness this amazing thing happening. Well, the original Christian partner was the Episcopal Church, and as opposed to the other two congregations, each of which, like the Jews and the Muslims, had a thriving community that they just simply moved. The Episcopalians didn't have a thriving community that wanted to move there. They were just like, so they're like, well, let's just kind of start the Church of the Tri-Faith. And well, they never kind of got that together for a number of reasons we don't need to get into. But I started watching them failing at this task, pulling together the Tri-Faith, and I started simultaneously getting the intuitions. Eric, pick up the phone, call the rabbi or call the bishop, ask if they need help. And I'm like, oh my God, no, that will unleash a can of worms I can't even imagine. I mean, can you imagine like me proposing in my congregation, who we were in a neighborhood we loved for 65 years. We were in a building we loved. Oh, you want to sell the building and move, from the neighborhood you love to the Tri-Faith Initiative, and you want to cough up a whole lot of money to pay for the privilege of moving from the building and neighborhood you love. Forget it.
Right.
So I fought this instinct for a year, and finally it became too much. And I did pick up the phone, and guess what happens? Yeah, we were offered the opportunity. We were offered the opportunity to become the Christian partner and replace the Episcopalians. Well, en route to that offer, I knew that offer was coming, and I remember sitting down with a group of clergy colleagues at a conference. I was telling them about this amazing Tri-Faith initiative, and they're like, "That's the coolest thing ever!" You're like, and my church is going to be invited to be the partner, and they're like, "That's so cool," but you can't do that. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, no, you will be fired. They will never vote for this. They're not. No church ever moves just for a vision. Usually there has to be like some other reason also, like the roof is caving in, or it's the neighborhood match isn't right for them, or whatever. And so they will vote this down, and then you will no longer be their minister. And so they will fire you. And luckily, I was going to go on a 3-day writing retreat. Actually, it was the writing retreat that started my book, Gifts of the Darkwood.
Okay.
And wait, no, I take that back. It was at the same place of the writing retreat that started Gifts of the Darkwood, but I turned it into a prayer retreat instead. Like for 3 days I prayed, and I realized, no, I really feel that those sweet spot moments have always been in alignment, and they continue, even though having this information, which they're right. All logic is on their side. And like, you shouldn't have to go ask your congregation to move from a neighborhood they love and a building they love and all this, but do it anyway. And yeah, they're going to have to pay to move. And so I went back and had that confidence that I could lose my job, but it was worth losing my job for. And I came back and we did propose this, and the feathers flew. We had there was some all-out brawling for a while there, but in the end, and we were a 1,700 member congregation. We lost 300 members because of that. Actually 200 members, 100 members who objected ended up coming with us. But in the end, we moved, and yet there were 200 people who said, "This is not in our best interest. This is unfair that you'd even ask this." We grew up here. We baptized our kids here. We were married here, or our grandchildren were married here, whatever it is. And you're going to ask us for $26 million to on top of that to move, but every ministry I've been in, there's always been a point where it's like, it becomes clear there's something the congregation is being called into that is going to be controversial enough. It will absolutely make them a more vital place, but also will risk your job in order to bring this forward. Every single congregation I've served, I've had to face that. And people call it inappropriate. People say this is not Christian. They'll say it's whatever it is, and happily for me, that's generally gone well until the last thing where the abusive situation that didn't go well. But in every other case, the congregation actually responded, and it totally changed the game for them. It totally turned them into operating according to their best energies rather than their will.
Yeah, and I mean, even the last one where it turned into abuse, it then became more personal, where you were able to evolve and expand in what seems like some really important ways.
Yeah.
And it sounds like during all these times where you've had to meet this part of yourself, where you knew you had a knowing that something needed to change, like you were listening to your heart. and that the heart is actually quite illogical at times.
Mm-hmm.
And that it usually thrusts us, if we're really listening deeply, it thrusts us into experience where we have to gather a tremendous amount of courage to
Mm-hmm.
face things that don't make sense
Mm-hmm.
to many other people, but that we know deep down. And so that is that kind of wildness that I imagine and speak to. And so to finish this conversation, if you could answer that question of like, what does it mean for you, the term, the story, wild heart revival? What does it
Mm-hmm.
mean to revive this wildness of heart?
I think I mean a lot of things in different communities. How I personally, like if I take this to Eric Elnes' story, not your story or somebody else's, I really think for in my own perennial tradition of Christianity, we are being invited right now to merge into what I call Christianity 3.0. Christianity 1.0 was the early church, those early days, they were being persecuted and all sorts. Christianity 2.0 is once Christianity became the religion of the empire in the 4th century with Constantine. And that's where it's been the whole time until like the last century or century and a half. It's really the religion of empire. Like it's our way or the hell way, so it's not just a political thing, it's also a theological, thing. But we live in a world now where we've grown and you don't have to be like a guru sitting on a mountaintop to realize that, maybe all these paths are headed up the same mountain, and they may be very different down lower on the mountain, but at the highest level of realization, there seems to be a oneness there, a unity there. And because now we have internet, we have world travel, we have books, the massive publications, the average person can get, whoa, I've seen, these same principles in other religions. And yet the world is in this huge amount of, and so Christianity is being called to shed this exclusivist, predominant thing and go back actually the 1st century where they weren't exclusivist then, actually, I would argue. But we're also, so we're really called to affirm that there are other ways of knowing that are not contradictory to Christian faith, that do not involve the other people converting into Christian faith, and that there are legitimate ways of knowing, legitimate paths that also Christians can benefit from. And right now we have this world that's so locked in chaos and confusion. I think actually it's not just Christianity; it's any of the perennial faiths are being called now to shed an older skin and adopt a newer skin, and try on these new garments, which to me is Christianity is Christian pluralism. But how it is with the evolutionary process. Like if you have if you put a bunch of like bacteria in a tray, and you put something on the other end of the tray that's poisonous to the bacteria, and as it seeps over and starts to touch the bacteria, what happens is the bacteria start to go into this, what they call an evolutionary shear point. They start to throw off mutation after mutation after mutation until finally they find a mutation that overcomes the toxin, and they're able to like take over the whole tray. And I think that's what we like. All of these perennial traditions right now are at the state of like, we've got all this toxins, and we're called to kind of generate a lot of mutations right now, many of which may lead to dead ends, but some of which are going to be the exact mutations that actually lead to building the new creature. It's like those imaginal cells in the caterpillar.
Right.
They were always part of the caterpillar, but they were never activated, and now they're being activated. And now they're being activated, everything is attacking it around it until those imaginal cells link up with enough imaginal cells to be able to overcome those attacks, and then mutate into the beautiful butterfly. It's the same kind of thing. So I think like as Christians, and this would go for any religion, but I think as Christians, we need to be wildly experimental. And we need to be looking at, how can these other perennial traditions inform our own faith, but we also need to acknowledge there's other ways of knowing too, like scientific ways of knowing. That's science needs to be very much more integrated into our faith. And there's other modalities. There's some of these modalities that have been considered esoteric, whether it be astrology or tarot, or people who feel like they're communicating across the divide with the dead, and these kind of things. I'm not, and also entheogens, like people who are taking ritualized, things like that. So I'm not, blessing all those paths, and I'm not saying they're all right and they're all good. I'm just saying we need people experimenting with those things to learn how to then, what life-bearing properties do they have, and then how can we integrate them into a way of using them, or engaging these disciplined, or using those substances or what have you in a disciplined manner that leads to actually light in life, not just simply like, well, if you're going to take entheogens, for instance, like it's not about just getting baked on a Sunday night, or Saturday night, it's like, if you were going to experiment with that, like how can you use that in a ritualized context that leads to higher awareness and not leading to brain dysfunction and all the dangers that go along with it, but actually you can, yield the beauty of it. Anyway, we just need to be very highly experimental, and that's so it's this new kind of level of wildness, because we know some of these may lead to dead ends, but we are mutating. It's almost, the last analogy I'd use is like the ants, like they go to in a line to the food, and there's a line coming back from the food, but then there's always like these ants that are out on the margins. They're nowhere in the line. You're like, well, why did evolution create ants that don't follow in the line with all the others? Well, you know why it is because when the foot gets down, blocks the path, these ants have already found a way around it, or they found a source of new food when that food dries up. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be honoring these outliers right now, and say, you're outside of the quote unquote orthodox tradition, but there's a role for you. There's a place for you. And it's not that all of you are going to lead us to better things. Some of you are going to lead us to dead ends, but we trust that on the whole, it's going to be from those outliers that we've discovered the new way of being that then leads us to the new sorts of food, and it sustains this life-bearing path.
Yeah, I love that answer, man. Yeah, because diversity is the rule of ecology, of Earth systems.
Yeah.
Diversity equals resilience, equals health and vitality. So of course, when it comes to our ways of knowing and being with the world, and our orientations toward the world and each other and ourselves, the more diversity and the more experimentation, the more wildness and vitality can come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's not all just, warm and fuzzy, because there are dangers there too, right? You're gonna be a extreme sports player. You're gonna wreck your bike once in a while too, but you just might find that cool new path too,
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh man, thank you so much for this. This was such a great conversation. I really appreciate you being here with us today.
Well, thank you. Well, you've asked some really wonderful questions, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness and your sensitivity to these parts of life. I wish you the best in rewilding this world, helping to rewild it.
Yeah, you too. And so, is there anywhere you want to direct people to? Like, do you have something that you really want to share that's coming up in the coming months, or anything like that?
Sure. Well, I always love to draw attention to the Tri-Faith Initiative, even though I'm no longer serving the church there, but that's a pretty cool thing. And then I've got a project in the works right now, but you won't find anything on the internet about it. It's called the Eden Tree Foundation. And we're going to be working on using technology, like this kind of technology, but also emerging technologies, including VR and AR, the metaverse kind of technologies, to do work in that space for spiritual exploration and interfaith relationship, and also working to promote this understanding of Christian pluralism, again, which is claiming the path of Jesus without denying the legitimacy of other paths that God creates for humanity. So that's coming when you see Eden Tree. But in the meantime, I just encourage your listeners to pay attention to the other people who you're interviewing. There's a fun podcast that I've really enjoyed too. I don't have any relationship with them, and I've never been interviewed by them, but I've really enjoyed the Next Level Soul podcast, and have found a number of people who are got some really great thoughts, on that podcast too.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that. Sweet. Okay.
Pleasure. And Gifts of the Dark Wood. That's the book. I've written several books, but that's my best one.